The children were gone before the sun touched the ridge. Smoke still rose from the fires. The blankets lay where small bodies had been. Before we continue, subscribe for more Western stories and comment where you're watching from. The first mother to wake found the empty space beside her and stood without sound. She walked to the next shelter and saw the same, then the next. By the time the eastern sky turned gray, 8 women stood in the center of the settlement, staring at tracks that led west toward the trading post. The tracks were fresh and deep. Horses, many of them. The prints of small feet showed where the children had been made to walk before being lifted. One set of prints showed dragging. Something had been dropped in the grass, a woven doll no larger than a hand. The women did not speak. They moved through the settlement gathering what could be carried: knives, dried meat, water skins. 2 of them had rifles taken from dead soldiers years before. The others carried bows. An older woman whose daughter had lost 3 children in fever the winter before did not arm herself. She only tied a blanket across her shoulders and began walking west. The others followed. The settlement emptied behind them. Old men and women too sick to travel watched them go. The fires were left burning. No one knew if they would return to tend them. The tracks led through pine forest where the ground stayed soft. The women moved in a line with the oldest in front. She read the earth like scripture. Here a horse had stumbled. There a child had tried to run and been caught. The women passed these signs without pausing. The forest grew denser as they moved west. The canopy blocked out the sun. Moss hung from branches like torn cloth. The air was thick and still. Insects swarmed around their faces. They walked without brushing them away. The tracks remained clear in the soft earth. By mid-morning, they came upon a place where the party had stopped. Boot prints everywhere. The remains of a small fire. And something else. A child's footprint in the mud at the edge of a stream. Bare. The moccasin lay nearby in the water, too small. Made for a girl no more than 6 years old. One of the women waded into the stream and retrieved the moccasin. She held it against her chest. Her daughter's. She tied it to her belt and kept walking. The tracks led out of the forest into rolling hills covered in scrub brush. The sun beat down without mercy. By midday, they reached the clearing where the party had stopped to rest. The ashes of a fire, horse dung. A strip of cloth torn from a shirt that belonged to one of the boys. The woman who recognized it picked it up and tied it around her wrist. She did not cry. But there was more here. Broken branches where someone had been dragged into the bushes. The women searched and found marks in the dirt. A struggle, dried blood on the leaves. Not much, enough to tell a story. One of the children had fought back and been struck for it. The tracks turned south. They followed into open country where the grass grew tall and the wind came steady from the west. No trees for shelter. No water except what they carried. The sun burned their faces. They walked through the afternoon without stopping. The grass stretched in all directions like an ocean. The sky was empty of clouds. One of the younger women began to limp. A stone had cut through her moccasin. Blood darkened the leather. She did not slow down. Another woman tore a strip from her own clothing and wrapped the foot without being asked. They kept moving. The wounded woman's pace began to falter as the afternoon wore on. The blood seeped through the wrapping. The oldest woman looked back at her and then at the sun. Still hours before dark, she made a decision. They would not stop. The wounded woman understood. She bit down on a strip of leather and kept walking. By evening, the grass gave way to harder ground. Sparse vegetation, rocks jutting from the earth like broken teeth. The tracks were harder to follow here, but the oldest woman found them. A scrape on stone where a horseshoe had struck. A tuft of grass crushed by weight. They moved slower, but they did not stop. When darkness came, they did not make camp. They walked by moonlight. The moon was 3/4 full and bright enough to see the ground ahead. The temperature dropped. The women wrapped their blankets tighter. The wounded woman's breath came in short gasps, but she kept pace. Near midnight, they came to a dry riverbed. The tracks descended into it and disappeared among the stones. The women climbed down. The riverbed was wide and filled with loose rock that shifted underfoot. They spread out searching for sign. It took an hour to pick up the trail on the far side. Before dawn they reached a creek and stopped to drink. The tracks crossed the water and continued south. The women refilled their skins and waded through. The water was cold and swift. It came up to their thighs. The current pulled at them. The wounded woman stumbled and fell. 2 others caught her and held her up. They crossed together and collapsed on the far bank. The oldest woman allowed them 10 minutes to rest. Then she stood and they stood with her. On the far bank they found a place where the horses had been tied while the men slept. The droppings were still warm. Fresh prints showed the men had left less than 2 hours before. They were close. The oldest woman held up her hand and the others stopped. She pointed to a line of cottonwoods a mile distant. Smoke rose thin and white against the morning sky. The women spread out and moved low through the grass. They made no sound. Their bodies had learned to move like shadows. As they drew near, they could see the camp. 4 white men in buckskin and wool. A wagon with iron bars across the back. The children sat inside the wagon pressed together. 9 of them. All from the settlement. Their faces were blank. They did not cry or call out. They sat as if they had learned that silence was the only safety left. The women stopped in the tall grass 50 yards from the camp. They watched. The men were eating bacon and beans from a pot over the fire. They laughed at something one of them said. One man walked to the wagon and poured water into a pan and shoved it through the bars. The children drank like animals. Their hands shook. Some of the water spilled. The oldest woman studied the camp. 4 men, all armed, rifles leaning against the wagon, pistols on their belts. The horses were tied to a picket line beyond the wagon. The land around the camp was open, no cover except the grass. They would have to cross 20 yards of open ground to reach the wagon. She looked at each of the other women in turn. She made signs with her hands. 2 women moved left, 2 moved right. The woman with the wounded foot stayed with the oldest woman. The woman with the rifle crawled forward until she was 30 yards from the nearest man. She rested the barrel on a rock and sighted down it. Her breathing slowed. She waited. The man by the wagon turned and saw movement in the grass. He squinted. His hand moved toward his pistol. The rifle spoke first. The sound cracked across the morning. The man fell backward and did not move. Blood spread across his chest. The other men scrambled for their weapons. 2 more shots came from the grass and 1 man spun and dropped. He hit the ground clutching his stomach. He rolled and tried to rise. Another shot put him down for good. The remaining 2 men dove behind the wagon. The children inside began to scream, high and shrill. The sound cut through everything. 1 man fired blindly around the wagon wheel. The bullet kicked up dirt 10 feet from where the women hid. The women on the flanks rushed forward. Arrows flew. 1 struck the wagon. Another buried itself in the ground. A third took one of the men in the thigh. He screamed and fell. The last man fired twice into the grass, and then a woman was on him with a knife. He swung his rifle like a club. It caught her in the shoulder and knocked her down. He raised the rifle to bring it down on her head. Another woman hit him from the side. They went down together. He was larger and stronger. He rolled on top of her and got his hands around her throat. She could not breathe. Her vision darkened. Then the oldest woman was there. She drove her knife into his back once, twice, 3 times. He shuddered and went limp. The woman with the wounded foot ran to the wagon. She tore at the lock, but it would not open. Another woman picked up a rock and smashed at it. The metal held. She hit it again. And again. The children pressed themselves against the far side of the cage. Their eyes were wide and empty. Their mouths open in silent screams. The lock broke on the 7th blow. The door swung open. The women reached in, but the children did not move. They sat frozen. The oldest woman climbed into the wagon. Blood from the knife still dripped from her hand. She wiped it on her dress and touched each child gently on the head. She spoke in their language, words their mothers had sung to them. Slowly they began to stir. One by one they climbed out. A small girl with a bruised face and split lip looked up at the woman who had carried the doll. Purple marks ringed her neck like a necklace. The woman knelt and the girl stepped forward and buried her face in the woman's shoulder. The woman's body shook, but she made no sound. Her hands moved over the girl's back, checking for injuries. She found more bruises, welts across the shoulders. The girl flinched at the touch. The other children moved toward the women who had come for them. Some recognized their mothers, others did not. They had been taken in the night, and terror had stolen their faces from memory. They moved slowly like old people. Their clothes were torn and filthy. They smelled of sweat and fear and something else. Something sour. One boy stood apart. He was the oldest, nearly 12. He looked at the women, and then at the dead men, and then back at the women. His expression did not change. When his mother reached for him, he stepped back. She stopped. They stood looking at each other across a distance of 3 feet that felt like miles. His face was bruised. One eye was swollen shut. His hands were bound with rope. His mother stepped forward slowly. She reached out and cut the rope. His hands dropped to his sides. He did not move them. She touched his face. He pulled away. She let her hand fall. The women searched the men's bodies. They found papers in a leather case. The oldest woman could not read English, but she studied the marks on the paper. Lists of names, numbers, signatures at the bottom, official seals pressed into wax. She folded the papers and put them inside her shirt. They also found coins and tobacco and whiskey. They took the coins and left the rest. One woman found a pistol in good condition and claimed it. Another found a knife with a bone handle. They unhitched the horses from the wagon. 4 strong animals, young and well-fed. They would be useful if they made it home. The woman who could read a little English opened one of the papers again. She traced the lines with her finger. Her face changed. She showed it to the oldest woman and pointed. The oldest woman's jaw tightened. She looked at the children. She counted them again. 9. She looked at the paper. She counted the names. 10. One child was missing. The women searched the wagon thoroughly. They found blankets stained with urine and blood. They found chains bolted to the floor. They found a wooden box with a lock. They broke the lock with a rock. Inside were more papers, documents with seals, a ledger with entries in neat script, money, a significant amount, gold coins. The woman who could read a little studied the papers. She pointed to one entry, a name, a date. The words delivered to Mission and St. Louis, and beside it a number. $30. One of the children had been taken further. The oldest boy, the one who had been chosen first. He had been separated from the others 2 days before and sent east with different men. The ledger showed the transaction, the signatures, the payment received. The women looked at each other. St. Louis was 200 miles away, maybe more. The river ran between here and there. They had 9 children and almost no food left, and winter was coming. They could not chase one child that far and keep the others alive. The mother of the missing boy stood apart from the group. She looked east. Her face was stone. The other women waited. She stood for a long time without moving. Then she turned and took the hand of the small girl, beside her daughter. The girl looked up at her. The woman knelt and held her daughter's face in both hands. She pressed her forehead to the girl's forehead. She whispered something the others could not hear. Then she stood and walked east. She did not look back. The oldest woman called to her. The woman kept walking. 2 others started after her, but the oldest woman held up her hand. They stopped. They watched the woman grow smaller against the horizon until she was just a dark line, and then nothing. The grass swallowed her whole. The remaining women gathered the children. They gave them water. They tried to give them food, but most could not eat. Their stomachs had been empty too long. The oldest woman examined each child. She found bruises and cuts. She found rope burns on wrists and ankles. She found fear so deep it had settled into their bones. They mounted the horses, 2 children to each animal, and 1 woman walking alongside. They left the wagon where it stood. They left the dead men for the crows. They took only what they could carry and turned north. The sun climbed behind them. The plain stretched out in all directions without end. They traveled through the morning. The horses moved at a steady walk. The children clung to them in silence. By noon the temperature rose. The heat shimmered off the ground in waves. There was no shade, no relief. The women's water skins grew light. The wounded woman's limp worsened. Blood had soaked through the wrapping again. She said nothing. In the afternoon they came to a stream. The water was brown and sluggish, but it was water. The horses drank. The women filled their skins. They tried again to get the children to eat. A few managed a bite or 2 of dried meat. Others could not. They sat by the water staring at nothing. The oldest woman noticed one of the younger girls shaking, not from cold. The day was hot. The girl's eyes were unfocused. Fever. The woman felt her forehead. Burning. She looked at the others. 2 more showed signs. Flushed faces, glassy eyes. She made the decision to rest here until morning. They made a poor camp in the shade of some willows. No fire. The smoke might draw attention. They laid the sick children down and covered them with blankets. The women took turns bathing their faces with cool water from the stream. The fever did not break. That night, the girl with the worst fever began to shake violently. Her teeth chattered. Her mother held her. The shaking went on for an hour. Then it stopped. The girl lay still. Her breathing was shallow and fast. The mother kept holding her. By morning the girl was worse. She could not open her eyes. Her skin was gray. The oldest woman examined her. She had seen this sickness before. In the wagon the children had been given spoiled food, bad water. Their bodies were trying to purge the poison. Some would survive it. Some would not. They could not stay. They had to keep moving. The woman with the sick girl lifted her daughter and mounted one of the horses. The girl's head lolled against her mother's chest. They rode north. The day grew hotter. The sick children worsened. Another began to shake with fever. Then a third. The women pushed on. There was nothing else to do. Stop and they would all die out here. Move and some might make it. By afternoon they were 15 miles from where they had camped. The landscape changed. The grass gave way to rocky ground. Hills rose in the distance. They were entering country the oldest woman recognized. 3 more days to the settlement if they kept this pace. But the children were failing. They stopped at a spring that seeped from rocks. The water was cold and clean. They gave it to the sick children. One of them drank and kept it down. The others could not. They retched and brought up nothing. Their bodies had nothing left. The woman with the wounded foot could no longer walk. Her leg had swollen to twice its normal size. The wound had gone bad. The smell told the story. She sat down and would not rise. The oldest woman knelt beside her. The wounded woman shook her head. She had made her choice. She would not slow them down. The oldest woman argued with signs. The wounded woman turned away. The others tried. The wounded woman would not look at them. Finally they understood. They left her water and what food they could spare. They left her a knife. Then they mounted up and rode north. The wounded woman watched them go. She did not call out. 3 days they rode. The children grew weaker. The boy who had pulled away from his mother sat in front of her on the horse staring ahead at nothing. He had not spoken since they found him. His mother tried to feed him. He would not eat. She gave him water. He drank mechanically like something that had forgotten how to want. On the second night one of the sick children died. The small boy who had cried the most in the first days. He simply stopped breathing. His mother held him until morning. When the others woke, she had already wrapped him in her blanket. They dug a grave with their hands and knives. The ground was hard. It took hours. They buried him shallow and marked it with stones. His mother sat beside the grave and would not move. The oldest woman gave her time. The sun climbed. The shadows shortened. Still the mother sat. Finally, the oldest woman took her by the shoulders and lifted her. The mother's body was limp. She had gone somewhere inside herself where they could not reach. They put her on a horse and tied her hands to the saddle so she would not fall. They rode on. That afternoon they saw smoke on the horizon. Too much smoke. Wrong place. The oldest woman climbed a hill to see. She stood looking north for a long time. When she returned, her face was grim. She made signs. The settlement was burning. They rode harder. The horses were tired, but they pushed them. As they drew closer, the smoke grew thicker. The smell reached them, burning wood and hide and something else. They came over a rise and looked down into the valley. Half the settlement was gone. The shelters on the eastern side had burned completely. The fires had spread through the dry grass. What remained was blackened earth and smoking ruins. The people had moved to the western edge near the creek. They saw the women coming and came out to meet them. But there were fewer now. The oldest woman counted. More than 20 missing. The settlement elder came forward. His face was ash-gray. He spoke with his hands. Soldiers had come the day after the women left. They had demanded to know where the children were. The old ones said they did not know. The soldiers had not believed them. They had burned shelters to make them talk. When the fires spread out of control, the soldiers had left. 3 of the old ones had died in the smoke. 2 children too young to flee. Others had scattered into the hills and not returned. The settlement was broken. The women climbed down from the horses. The people came forward and took the children. There were cries then, recognition, but also silence. Some of the children did not know their own families. They stared with empty eyes. They flinched when touched. The sick children were carried to shelters. The women who had stayed behind brought what medicine they had. Poultices of herbs and bark. They worked through the day and into the night. The fever took another child before dawn. A girl of 7 who had never spoken after being taken. She died without sound. They buried her beside the others who had not survived the fire. The boy who would not speak to his mother was taken to a shelter. His mother tried to stay with him, but he turned his face to the wall. She sat outside through the night. In the morning he was the same. She brought him food. He did not eat. She brought water. He drank a little. She tried to touch him. He pulled away. Days passed. The remaining fever broke in one child. Then another. 2 survived. 1 did not. The dead were buried in a line on the hillside, overlooking what remained of the settlement. The women who had ridden west took turns sitting with the mothers who had lost children. No words were spoken. There were no words for this. The settlement began the slow work of rebuilding. The women cut saplings and dragged them from the forest. They wove grass and bark into walls. The work was hard and endless. Food was scarce. The gardens had burned. The stores had been scattered or destroyed. They had only what they could hunt and gather. The children who had been taken did not help. They sat and stared. Some rocked back and forth. Some made sounds that were not quite crying. The women worked around them. They did not force the children to do anything. They only kept them close and safe. 3 weeks after their return, a woman arrived from the east. She was alone. She walked into the settlement at dusk and collapsed. They carried her to a fire. She was the one who had gone after her son. Her feet were bleeding. Her hands were torn. She had no weapons, no food. Her clothes were rags. She had walked 300 miles. They gave her water. She drank and vomited. They gave her broth. She kept it down. She slept for 2 days. When she woke, she spoke. Her voice was rough like stones grinding. She had followed the trail to St. Louis. It had taken her 30 days. She had walked along the river. She had begged food from travelers. Some had given her scraps. Others had chased her away. Dogs had attacked her twice. She had killed one with a rock and run from the other. she had found the mission. A large building with white walls and a cross on top. She had watched it for days. She had seen children in the yard. Boys in white shirts and dark pants, their hair cut short. They walked in lines. They did not speak. She had seen her son through a window. He was sitting at a table with other boys. They were writing on slates. A white man in black clothes stood over them with a stick. When one boy made a mistake, the man hit him across the shoulders. Her son had not looked up. He wrote carefully. His face showed nothing. She had tried to reach him. She went to the door. A woman answered. Black dress, white collar. The woman asked what she wanted. She said her son. The woman said there was no one here by that name. She pushed past. The woman called for help. Men came. They grabbed her arms. She fought. They dragged her to the street and threw her down. She had waited outside the mission for 2 days. She slept in an alley. She stole food from garbage. On the 3rd day, she saw the boys come out for exercise. They marched in a line around the yard. A man watched them with a rifle. She waited until they passed close to the fence. She called her son's name. The name she had given him. The name his father had chosen. He had looked up. He had seen her. His eyes met hers across the yard. She had seen recognition there. A flicker. Then it was gone. His face went blank. He looked away and kept walking. The man with the rifle had not noticed. The line marched on. Her son did not look back. She had tried again the next day. This time the man saw her. He came to the fence and told her to leave. She refused. He called for others. They came with dogs. She ran. The dogs chased her to the river. She jumped in. The current took her downstream. When she crawled out, the dogs were gone. She could not go back to the mission. She had nothing to offer. No money, no power, no way to take her son by force. The mission had papers. The law, soldiers. She had only herself, and that was not enough. So she had left St. Louis and walked home. She did not know why. She only knew she could not stay. The walk had taken 40 days. She had nearly died twice, once from hunger, once from cold when a storm caught her on the open prairie. She had survived by finding a dead buffalo and cutting into its belly and crawling inside for warmth. She had stayed there 3 days while the storm raged. When it passed, she had crawled out and kept walking. The women listened. No one spoke. The woman who had returned closed her eyes. She did not open them again that night. She slept for 3 more days. When she woke, she was different. Something inside her had broken. She did not speak again for months. She worked alongside the others, but her eyes were dead. She moved like a body with no one inside. Winter came early and hard. The first snow fell while the shelters were still unfinished. The people worked frantically to close the gaps and gather firewood. There was not enough of anything. Not enough wood. Not enough food. Not enough warm clothing. Not enough medicine. Not enough hope. The settlement was not ready. They had always survived winters before, but this one was different. They had lost too much. The fires had taken their stores. The soldiers had scattered their people. The taking of the children had broken something fundamental. The will to endure had cracked. 3 of the old ones died before the snows stopped. They simply went to sleep and did not wake. One morning, one afternoon, one in the deep night. The ground was frozen too hard to dig. The bodies were wrapped and placed on platforms in the trees, as was the custom. The birds and wind would take them. Food ran low by midwinter. The women went out in pairs to hunt, but the game had moved to lower ground. They set snares and caught rabbits. Sometimes, other times the traps stayed empty for days. They dug for roots beneath the snow. They scraped bark from trees and boiled it. They ate the leather from old moccasins. The children began to waste. Their ribs showed. Their eyes grew large in their faces. The ones who had been taken fared worse than the others. They would not eat even when food was offered. They had learned in the wagon that food could be a punishment, that eating meant pain later. Their bodies remembered what their minds could not hold. The mothers tried everything. They made the food as soft as possible. They mixed it with water until it was nearly liquid. They held the children and coaxed them like infants. Some of the children ate a little, others would not. They turned their faces away and pressed their lips tight. One of the girls who had been in the wagon stopped eating entirely. Her mother sat with her day and night. She sang to her. She told her stories. The girl did not respond. After a week, the girl could no longer stand. After 2 weeks, her breathing changed. On a gray morning when the wind howled outside the shelter, the girl stopped breathing. Her mother held her until the body was cold. Then she carried her daughter outside and laid her on a platform. She did not cry. She had no tears left. The boy who would not speak to his mother grew thinner. His mother watched him waste away and could do nothing. She tried to feed him. He took a bite and then stopped. She tried to talk to him. He stared past her. She tried to hold him. He went rigid in her arms. Every day she watched him disappear a little more. In the deep of winter, the women held a council. They sat around a fire and passed a pipe. They spoke of what had been lost and what remained. They counted the living and the dead. They made calculations. At this rate of loss, they would not survive until spring. A decision had to be made. Some suggested moving the settlement to lower ground, where game was more plentiful. Others argued they were too weak to travel. Some said they should send runners to other settlements to ask for help. Others said there was no help to ask for. Every settlement was struggling. Every people were under pressure from soldiers and settlers, and laws that changed like the weather. In the end, they decided to stay. They would endure as long as they could. They would not abandon the place where their people were buried. They would not leave the bones of their children. If they died here, at least they would die in the place that was theirs. The winter deepened. The cold grew fierce. Snow fell for days without stopping. The drifts rose higher than a man's head. The shelters disappeared beneath them. The people tunneled through the snow to move between dwellings. They burned furniture for warmth. They burned tools. They burned everything that would catch fire. On the coldest night of the year, a shelter caught fire from a spark. The flames spread quickly. The people inside scrambled out into the snow. One woman was too slow. She was trapped when the roof collapsed. Her screams lasted only moments. Then silence. The fire burned itself out. In the morning, they found her body in the ashes. They could not remove it. The ground was frozen solid. They left her there and covered the remains with snow. The boy who had wandered at night began to walk in his sleep. His mother would wake to find him gone. She would search and find him standing in the snow staring south. His feet were bare. His body was blue with cold. She would carry him back to the shelter and wrap him in blankets. In the morning, he would not remember. This happened again and again. She began to tie a rope around his waist at night. He would wake choking against it, trying to walk. One night she forgot to tie the rope. She woke at dawn to find him gone. She ran out into the snow calling his name. She found his tracks leading south. She followed them. The tracks went on and on through the drifts. She followed for miles. The tracks ended at a frozen stream. She searched both banks. She found nothing. He was gone. She searched for 3 days. The other women helped. They combed the area for miles in every direction. They found nothing, no body, no sign. He had vanished into the winter like smoke. His mother stopped eating. She sat in the shelter staring at the place where he had slept. After a week, the others had to force food into her mouth. After 2 weeks, she began to move again. But she was not the same. Something had broken that could not be mended. Spring came late. When the snow finally began to melt, the settlement emerged like something dead coming back to life. But it was not life. It was something else. The people moved slowly. They spoke rarely. They worked without energy or hope. They were surviving, but nothing more. When the ground thawed, they buried the dead who had waited on platforms through the winter. They dug graves in the soft earth. They lowered the bodies wrapped in what remained of blankets and hides. They covered them with soil. They marked each grave with stones, the hillside filled with markers. More dead than living now. The woman who had walked to St. Louis began to speak again, her first words in months. She spoke to the woman who had lost her son in the winter. She told her that some losses could not be measured, that some pain had no words. That survival was not always a blessing. The other woman nodded. They sat together in silence. After that, they were often seen together. Two mothers who had lost everything. They did not speak of their sons. There was nothing to say. They planted what seeds they had saved. The women worked the soil with their hands and with tools fashioned from bones and wood. The children helped. Some of them had begun to come back from wherever they had gone inside themselves. They moved among the living again. They spoke a little. They ate. They played sometimes, though their games were quiet and strange. The boy who had pulled away from his mother began to show signs of returning. He allowed her to touch him. He ate the food she gave him. He slept near her at night without turning away. One morning he spoke, 3 words. He asked for water. His mother brought it. He drank. He handed back the cup and looked at her. His eyes held something that had not been there before. Recognition. She touched his face. He did not pull away. But other children did not return. They remained locked inside themselves. They did not speak or play or show emotion. They existed, but they did not live. Their mothers cared for them, but it was like caring for shadows. The children were there, but also gone. Lost to something that had no name. One morning the boy who had pulled away from his mother was gone. His mother searched the settlement. She found his tracks leading south. She followed them to the edge of the clearing and stopped. She stood looking at the forest. The tracks disappeared into the trees. She did not go further. She stood there for an hour. Then she returned to the settlement and did not speak of it. A week later he returned. He was thinner. His clothes were torn. He carried a rabbit he had killed. He gave it to his mother. She took it. She cleaned it and cooked it. They ate together in silence. She did not ask where he had been. He did not tell her. After that he stayed. He worked with the other men gathering wood and repairing shelters. He hunted with the older boys. He was there, but something in him remained elsewhere. Looking south. Always south. Summer came but brought little relief. The game had not returned. The gardens grew poorly. The soil was tired. The people were tired. Everything was tired. They harvested what they could. It was not enough. They knew already it would not be enough. They began to prepare for another winter they might not survive. In the late summer, 2 men arrived from the east. White men. They carried papers. They said they were from the government. They said the land where the settlement stood was needed for a road. The people had to move. They would be given new land to the west. Better land. More fertile. The men showed maps. They pointed to places no one recognized. The settlement elder listened. He asked questions with his hands and through an interpreter who had come with the white men. Where was this new land? How far? Who else lived there? The white men answered with words that meant nothing. They used phrases like treaty provisions and allotment and civilization fund. None of it made sense. All of it meant the same thing. They had to leave. The elder refused. The men said he had no choice. The papers had been signed. The law was clear. The elder said he had signed no papers. The men said others had signed for him. Leaders of the tribe. The elder said he knew of no such leaders. The men grew impatient. They said soldiers would come if the people did not move voluntarily. The elder said let them come. The white men left. They rode east. The settlement waited. A week passed. Then another. No soldiers came. The people began to hope the threat had been empty. They continued their work. They prepared for winter as best they could. Then on a morning in early autumn the soldiers arrived. 20 men on horseback. An officer in a blue uniform. They rode into the settlement with rifles across their saddles. The officer announced that the people had 10 days to pack and leave. After that, the settlement would be cleared by force. The people gathered to listen. The women who had ridden west stood at the front. The oldest woman stepped forward. She spoke in her language. The interpreter translated. She said this land held their dead. They could not leave their dead. The officer said the dead could be moved. The woman said they would not be moved. The officer said then they would be left behind. The woman said they would not leave them. The argument went on. The officer grew angry. He said the people were standing in the way of progress, that the old ways were finished, that they had to accept the new order. The oldest woman said nothing. She simply stood and looked at him. After a time, the officer stopped talking. He turned his horse and rode out of the settlement. The soldiers followed. The people knew the soldiers would return. They made preparations, not for war. They had no chance against 20 armed men, but for what they would do when the soldiers came to force them out. Some began packing. Others refused. Arguments broke out. Families split. Some said survival meant accepting the move. Others said survival meant staying. Both were right. Both were wrong. The boy who had returned and stayed began to walk at night again. His mother woke to find him gone. She found him standing at the southern edge of the settlement, looking into the darkness. She asked him what he saw. He said nothing. She asked him what he was looking for. He said his brother. The boy who had been taken to St. Louis. The boy who had been sold and renamed and lost. She stood beside him. They looked south together. The stars turned above them. They stood until dawn. The 10 days passed. On the morning of the 11th day, the soldiers returned. More of them this time. 40 men, wagons. The officer ordered the people to begin loading their belongings. Most complied. They carried bundles and placed them in the wagons. They moved slowly. The soldiers watched. The officer grew impatient. He ordered his men to begin dismantling the shelters. The women who had ridden west stood in front of the graves on the hillside. They would not move. The officer rode up and ordered them aside. They did not move. He ordered his men to remove them. The soldiers dismounted and approached. The women stood firm. The soldiers reached for them. The women resisted. A struggle broke out. One soldier struck an old woman. She fell. The other women surged forward. The soldiers pushed them back. More soldiers came. The women fought with fists and nails. They were beaten down. They rose and fought again. Finally, they were subdued and held. The officer ordered the graves opened. The soldiers began to dig. The women screamed. The people in the wagons watched in silence. The soldiers dug up the bodies. Some were recent. Others were old just bones. They loaded them onto a wagon without care. Bones and rotted cloth and the things that had been buried with the dead. All thrown together like trash. The oldest woman broke free from the soldier holding her. She ran to the wagon and tried to climb in. A soldier pulled her down. She fought him. He struck her across the face. She fell and did not rise. The other women screamed her name. They struggled against the men holding them. It was no use. When the graves were all opened and the bodies all removed, the soldiers set fire to the remaining shelters. The flames rose. The smoke darkened the sky. The people watched their home burn. Some cried. Some stood in silence. Some turned away and would not look. The officer ordered everyone into the wagons. The people climbed in. They sat among their belongings and the bones of their dead. The wagons began to move. They rolled west out of the valley. The people looked back at the burning settlement. They watched until the smoke disappeared behind the hills. Then they faced forward. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. The journey west took 3 weeks. The wagons moved slowly over rough ground. The soldiers hurried them along. There was no rest, little food. The people ate what they had brought. When that ran out, they ate what the soldiers gave them. Hardtack and salt pork. Some of the old ones could not eat it. They grew weak. 2 died on the journey. Their bodies were left beside the trail. The wagons did not stop. The children who had been taken in the wagon sat with their mothers and stared at nothing. They had been broken once. Now they were broken again. The removal was the second taking. The land that had held their history was gone. The graves of their ancestors abandoned. Everything they knew erased. The new land, when they reached it, was flat and empty. Grass and nothing else. No trees. No water except a muddy creek. The soldiers unloaded the wagons and left. The people stood in the grass with their belongings piled around them. They looked at the place where they were supposed to start again. It looked like the end of the world. They set up crude shelters. They dug for water. They planted what seeds they had left. The soil was thin. The crops grew poorly. By autumn it was clear they would not have enough food for winter. They sent hunters out. The hunters found nothing. The land was empty of game. It had been hunted out by others who had come before them. The oldest woman, who had led the pursuit of the children, did not survive the first winter in the new place. She died in her sleep on a night when the wind screamed across the plains. They found her in the morning. Her face was peaceful. They wrapped her in blankets and placed her on a platform. There were no trees, so they built the platform from salvaged wood. It was not tall enough. The coyotes got to her body before the birds. The women drove them off, but it was too late. They gathered what remained and buried it in the ground. They marked the spot with stones carried from miles away. It took them days. They did it without complaint. The woman who had walked to St. Louis grew weaker through the winter. The walk had broken something inside her that never healed. By spring she could not rise from her blankets. Her daughter sat with her. On a morning when the sky was clear and the birds were loud in the grass, the woman stopped breathing. Her face was turned east, toward St. Louis, toward her son. They buried her beside the oldest woman. Her daughter placed a stone on the grave, just one stone. It was all she could carry. The children who had been taken grew taller. Some of them began to remember how to smile. Some of them forgot what they had seen in the wagon. Others carried it in their eyes for the rest of their lives. The boy who had pulled away from his mother learned to speak again. He helped with the work. He hunted. He provided for his family, but he never stopped looking south. Every evening he would walk to the southern edge of their new settlement and stand looking at the horizon. His mother would watch him from a distance. She never asked what he was looking for. She already knew. Years passed. The settlement in the new place grew smaller. More children were taken by different men under different laws. The government schools, the missions, the families who wanted servants. Some children were taken and never returned. The records said they died. The mothers did not believe the records. They believed their children were alive somewhere with new names and new faces, and no memory of who they had been. Some of the children who had been in the wagon grew up and had children of their own. They did not speak to their children about what had happened. The words were too heavy. The memories too dark, but their children felt it anyway. They felt it in the silence, in the way their mothers flinched at sudden movements, in the way their fathers stared at nothing. The trauma passed down like blood. The settlement was finally abandoned in 1889. The government declared the land open for homesteading. White settlers moved in. They built houses and barns and fences. They plowed the grass under and planted wheat. Within a generation, the place looked like it had always been theirs. The stones that marked the graves were scattered. The platforms rotted and collapsed. The bones mixed with the soil. The land forgot, or seemed to. But the people remembered. Those who scattered to reservations and distant towns carried the stories with them. The story of the women who rode west to save their children. The story of the wagon and the men who were killed. The story of the walk to St. Louis and the boy who was lost. The story of the removal and the burning settlement. All of it passed down in whispers, in fragments, in the space between words. The boy who had stood every evening looking south lived to be an old man. He married. He had children and grandchildren. He never stopped looking south. Even when he was too old to stand, he would sit facing that direction. His grandchildren would ask him what he was looking for. He never answered. On the day he died, he was sitting in a chair facing south. His eyes were open. His face was calm. His last breath went out toward the horizon, toward his brother, who had been taken and renamed and lost in a mission in St. Louis. A brother he had not seen since he was 12 years old. A brother who might have died or might have lived and forgotten everything. A brother who existed now only in the act of looking. Years later, when the settlement was long forgotten and the people scattered to places far from the new land, a young girl asked her grandmother about the marks on her wrist-thin white scars, like lines drawn by a knife. The old woman looked at her wrist. She touched the scars. She had gotten them in the wagon. Rope burns that never fully healed. She told the girl that once there had been children who were taken and mothers who went after them. She told her that some came back and some did not. She told her that the land witnessed it all, and the land did not forget even when people did. The girl asked if the mothers had won. The old woman did not answer for a long time. Then she said that winning was not the word for what had happened. They had survived, some of them. That was all. Survival was not victory, but it was something. It was the passing of breath from one generation to the next. It was the telling of stories that should not be forgotten. It was the act of standing when everything said to fall. That was what the mothers had done. They had stood. And because they had stood, their children stood. And because their children stood, their children's children stood. And so on down through time. The girl asked if it would ever end. The old woman closed her eyes. She said she did not know. She said that some things do not end. They only change shape. They become part of the ground you walk on, and the air you breathe, and the silence between words. They become the way you hold your children at night, and the way you teach them to run when strangers come. They become the reason you remember, even when remembering is painful. They become who you are. The old woman opened her eyes and looked west toward the mountains, where the sun was setting. The light turned the peaks red and gold. The shadows grew long across the grass. Somewhere in the distance a bird called out. Another answered. The sound carried on the wind and faded. The old woman listened until she could hear nothing but the wind itself. Then she closed her eyes again and sat in silence, holding the memory of children who were taken and mothers who rode after them, and a land that witnessed everything and forgot nothing, even when it seemed to forget everything.
Thanks for watching this story till the end. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And before you go, check out these other amazing Western stories waiting for you next. Subscribe, like, and I'll see you on the next ride.